Hey folks, Randy Arsenault here from redfridaytalks.help. I'm here once again with Dave Connor. Dave, how you doing today, bud?
Good to see you, brother. You doing okay?
Yeah, doing really good.
Excellent.
Listen, we were chatting earlier, and the topic of volunteer firefighters came up. Now, we were chatting before, and you're a retired firefighter and fire chief, and there was a couple things that I found really interesting that I think the majority of the public would actually find really interesting because it's things that I didn't know. And to start, it's how many volunteer firefighters actually exist. I didn't
Hmm.
realize there was more volunteer firefighters than there are actually firefighters getting paid.
Right. Yeah, well, that's a good start in the conversation. I don't know if my numbers are accurate, but up until a few years ago, there was somewhere in the 9 to 10,000 career firefighters in Ontario, and something
Wow.
in the 20,000 range for volunteer or part-time firefighters. So a 2 to 1 ratio of volunteers versus what we call a career.
Okay, that is interesting. Quick question.
Sure.
I'm under the assumption that just like police auxiliaries, I'm
Yeah.
under the assumption that a lot of volunteer firefighters, not all, but want to eventually become a firefighter full time as a career. Is that
I
would I be
think
correct?
certainly what we found over the last several decades where I've been involved is
Yeah.
there's been periods of times where volunteer firefighters found it very easy to get career jobs because they had been sent to the colleges and stuff and had lots of qualifications, if you like, lots of check marks and boxes that at the time city boys couldn't do because they couldn't volunteer in their community. There are no volunteer, well, let me see, in full-time career departments, you don't also see a cadre of volunteers. You sometimes see what we call a composite department. A good example would be Milton, Ontario.
Okay.
That's got career people working, and then a group of volunteers that they can call on as fires and events get larger. So it's a really difficult thing to really put your fingers on, but those numbers are fairly close to accurate.
And you brought up something that was kind of my next question. I
Mm.
would imagine that the training to become a firefighter would be what's required to actually join the job to become a firefighter. I would imagine they have to take all kinds of different training, and also would they pay for that on their own, the training?
Interesting. Good question. Um, People who are looking to get picked up by career departments will have to go to a college at their own expense.
Okay.
That's in the realistically $7 to $10,000 range to get
Oh,
firefighter 1 and 2, which are NFPA standards. It's
okay.
my understanding that most volunteer departments have an internal mechanism to either train people for those NFPA standards or to test them for those NFPA standards. So I'm not 100% certain, but I believe part of what they really essentially have to do for volunteers is to provide that training for them without cost. Remember, the people who do that work, the volunteers, they got lives of their own. They've got jobs, they got families. It's not something that they can't go to school for 12 weeks. They simply can't do that. And you're
Right.
expecting a lot from a person to volunteer their minds, bodies, and souls to an organization that can hurt them. You have to at least train them if you're not going to pay them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, great point. So you mentioned NFPA. What does that stand
So
for?
yeah, there's an international standard called the National Fire Protection Association (NFPA). You will see that on things like fire extinguishers
I
and
see.
fire hose and stuff, and it's a standard system for various applications of fire. So, for example, there is more than one for fire hose. There's a standard for fire apparatus.
Okay.
There's a standard for breathing apparatus. There's a standard for helmets and bunker gear. So that those are the standards that if you're going to be, if you want to run an organization that you're not getting sued all the time, you want to be NFPA compliant.
Now, something that we were speaking about this morning during our chat, our regular Red Friday Talks check-in,
Mhm.
was something else that I actually never thought about. Now, myself being involved in policing most of my life,
Sure.
and I mean most of my life coming from a family of police officers, there's auxiliary police officers and such. Now, you mentioned that firefighters, volunteer firefighters, they have careers, they have jobs, they have families. Now, what would be, I think, kind of the listen, volunteer firefighters, they're unsung heroes. I don't know if they get nearly the recognition that they deserve, but also I think a lot of recognition has to go to the companies, the businesses and organizations that they work for that are allowing them to
You're
drop
totally right.
to,
And
to leave. And
there's
that's something
been,
I never thought about. Can you touch
yeah,
on that?
yeah, it's totally true. And there's a kind of an onion of issues here. One being that
Yeah.
um, volunteer fire departments typically have the resources they need evenings and weekends because
Okay.
people are home and the tones go off and they can respond. But where there's always a gap is in the daytime, the business week daytime, where so for example, you probably couldn't, if you live in an area that is protected by a volunteer department. I'm not really sure you are, but I know you're in the city of Toronto quite a lot. So if your pager went off in the city, you can't respond. So the volunteer issue is always about council setting a standard level or a service level that can be met. And the other
Okay.
piece is, can you get 8 firefighters on the scene in 8 or 10 minutes during the business week, during the
Right.
day? So
Right.
there's two things we need to think about. One is, um, yeah, hats off to the employers that have an understanding with letting their people go in the middle of the day if they get a call. Very much like organizations that support reservists in the military, right? They need to be able to get
Yep.
off work to go and do what do they call that? When they do service abroad, they have to be freed up, and that job has to be there when they get back. So in the volunteer fire world, they have to either be self-employed or have an employer who is extremely understanding. So yeah, we salute those
Right.
employers, but an awful lot of, especially in your more rural areas, the volunteers are the mechanic at the shop, the farmer, the
Yep.
guys that are running a business of their own. And now it's an unintended positive consequence of COVID, but people are now actually digging in their heels and saying, no, I insist on being able to work from home. I did it for you for 2 years when it was convenient for you. I'm going to do it now when it's convenient for me. That's a lot of return to work. You see a lot of return to work
Right.
conversations in the media. That's something that I think has a net benefit for volunteer fire departments, because if you can get 4 or 5 people in the daytime, 4 or 5 really well trained people in the daytime, can stop something from getting so completely out of hand that it destroys the entire local economy. That's something that you kind of have to think about, is
Yeah.
in the volunteer service, because so much of the time so much time is taking at the detection and response and preparation times, that by the time they get onto a scene, the status or the circumstances of that scene are oftentimes way different than what people originally phoned in.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
so if you got two buildings that are fully engaged in fire beside a building that's not fully engaged in fire, the attack is for the not involved building. We don't go after the two that are on fire, because if we don't get them, they're going to take the third building. So that's a different kind of life than career jobs, where because we have a compressed response and preparation time, we can oftentimes get to a building while the fire's only, say, on one floor of the building. So then those
Amazing.
guys will go in and get it. Whereas if you take, and in cities it's the same. If you take 15 minutes to get to a call, you mostly have an out of control mess.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Listen, it's a quick conversation today, but what we talked about is certainly something that I never would have thought of, even being in emergency services for so many years. And I
Mhm.
think I'd like to push this out to some of the colleges and universities, or places where I want to push this out to individuals who are considering becoming volunteer firefighters or even a career in firefighting. So, listen, thanks
Certainly
for the chat.
something that at Red Friday we're dipping our toe into that pond. There's people who provide services and stuff, and I see us doing more of a consulting service. And I'm
Yeah.
happy to, this may generate some replies from your vast viewership base. And if they tell me I'm wrong with my numbers, I'll apologize. And if they want to continue the conversation, that's good.
Yeah, that's
I'm
great.
not a I'm not an expert on volunteer firefighting. I'm a career command chief, but in the last 20 years or so, I've trained many volunteer fire departments in peer support. And that's where my connection is with that community. That's why I have a soft spot for volunteers, because they
Yeah.
oftentimes run calls where they know people. And that's a conversation we could have another day as well.
Yeah, and we will have that conversation. If there's one thing I know from social media is people have no problem pointing out when you're wrong.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
Please get back to us when you're sure we're right, folks.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's a heck of a lot of volunteer firefighters. That's the
A
point,
heck
and
of a
we're
lot,
very,
and then
very thankful.
they have
Yeah,
families, and I'll
amazing.
bet you get some comments like, "Finally, somebody's talking about us," and
Yeah,
somebody's going
yeah,
to say, "What is that dope?" No, there's actually 21,308 of us, so
yeah,
whatever.
yeah. Okay. All right, brother.
Great pleasure, man. Always.
As always, and also as always, if anybody wants information, please check out redfridaytalks.help.
Dot help. That's us.
Have a
Thanks.
great day.